Hi guys, so finally it is time. A lot of you have been requesting this video for a very long time, and again I've been putting Loona off because they kind of scare me for a number of reasons. Mainly they're a 12-person girl group and they take me a while to learn, but I've been working hard all day and all week to try and get them and work them out, and I think I've finally got a pretty, not definitive vocal ranking necessarily, but in my opinion this is kind of how they line up in terms of vocal ability. The interesting thing about Loona is all the way through these little battles going on. A lot of the times groups have obvious placements as to who's where and who's really good vocally or not so good vocally, but this group there's no official positions as far as I can work out, and there's a lot of people that could conceivably be into switch depending on kind of your preference and what you think is really good from vocals. So that's why I really have enjoyed doing this episode. It's been really fun to work out who's kind of where, and there's a lot of differing opinions online, which is always really fun when I can interject my own in that particular sphere. Okay, one thing that if you don't know when I do a larger group I'm going to do is normally I speak for like 2.5 minutes or so on each member. I'm going to cut that way down and try and be as concise as possible in terms of what they're doing vocally, weaknesses, strengths, all that sort of thing. A nice concise package so this video isn't 45 minutes long, because I have had a habit of doing that before. I want to make it a nice, easy, concise episode. So, without further ado, let's get on to Loona's vocal ranking. Let's go. Okay, so Vivi isn't a weak vocalist necessarily. I would say she's an underdeveloped vocalist. Of course, she had the disadvantage of being the only foreign member, and Korean's obviously not her mother tongue, so that makes it more difficult to practice. But she tries her best, and she's got a decently soothing voice. Okay, let's watch her sing, and I'll try and break it down. Okay, so Vivi's main vocal strength is the soothing, calm quality her voice has. The way that she sings very soft and very light, but she also uses a large amount of air in her sound. So, because you're using predominantly air and not much chord closure, her voice hasn't got a lot of versatility or really the grab of chest voice to get into a higher space particularly effectively. So most of the time she's in a very calm, very breathy, very light setting, which means that her voice in the middle and kind of lower end of her voice is comfortable, it's easy, it's not difficult at all to produce, and technically it's not really standout or doing anything particularly impressive, but she has a nice calming, as I say, easy, soothing quality to her voice. But that doesn't mean technically skilled or anything. She doesn't really get into a higher space, utilise her head voice a great deal. She just has a soft, easy, light, breathy tone. And that breathy tone, as I say, it allows it to get into the middle of her voice nice and efficiently. It lightens it really easily and really efficiently, but she just doesn't have the grab of chest voice or much chord closure in her sound, or a particularly varied, a particularly powerful, or particularly technically impressive instrument. That doesn't mean she can't improve, of course she can, but right now she's a soft, airy, light vocalist, which some people really stylistically enjoy a lot, but technically it does limit her somewhat. Okay, so in my opinion, these two positions, 12 and 11th, are the easiest to pin down because Gowon and Vivi both use that light, soft approach. In my opinion, Gowon's got a little bit more to her voice because she's a little bit more chord closure, but we'll get into that. Let's watch her sing. Okay, so as I say, Gowon's technique isn't the same as Vivi's necessarily. There's a little bit more chord closure, a little bit more grab, and a little bit more of projection. But her voice is very much a unique stylistic voice once again. She sings in a very cutesy vocal style, like very wide but shallow vowels. A lot of yeah. It keeps the voice very light and very unique and very easy to produce once again. She isn't really forcing much weight up into her vocal tone, trying to make it a big projected sound. So the sound that she has is very consistent, very easy to produce, but very limited. But as I say, because Vivi uses a lot of air, Gowon's voice is a little bit more versatile. It does get into a medium and higher space a little bit more efficiently, because it does have that natural nasality to thin things out and place the voice a little bit more forward to make it a little tiny bit bigger. Again, she doesn't have a great deal of power or much projection because she doesn't use a great deal of chord closure in her sound, which means that as she goes higher, she's kind of forced into more of a falsetto or head voice flip because her voice isn't used to really having that grab and that power. So again, it makes her voice less versatile, a little bit more versatile than Vivi's personally for me, because it has, as I say, that little bit of grab, but generally her voice doesn't do anything technically impressive in terms of a mix or a head voice, but it's very easy and very soothing again if you like that sort of vocal style. Now, exciting times. This for me is the first really conceivable vocal battle. You've got Olivia Hye and the person who is next. In my opinion, Olivia's voice is a little bit less varied and versatile than the next person coming up, but she's still pretty decent and there's a little bit of a jump in quality here. Let's watch her sing. Okay, so Olivia's voice is really interesting. She has one of the more deeper, kind of fuller voices generally when she speaks, when she does some of the rap parts. But her voice, again, is in that more cute, kind of soft, light setting. In my opinion, Gowon's voice is a little bit more stylistic than Olivia's voice is. Olivia has a little bit more in the tank to work with. She has slightly better lower notes and slightly more chord closure and projection. And kind of as she goes into the middle of her voice, again, she's using a more wide mouth and shallow vowel to kind of get that more cutesy, light vocal style. But her voice sounds a lot more consistent and sounds like in that particular middle part of her voice, she's got a little bit more in terms of melody and tuning and kind of pitch to work with as she gets into that space, a little bit more efficiently, using a little bit less nasality, but bringing the voice kind of forward. Again, it is a little bit too cutesy to really make it technically that efficient, and as she tries to go a little bit higher, because she doesn't use a great deal of chord closure in her sound, her voice again doesn't have that grab to really know what it feels like to belt or to mix or to do anything particularly impressive in that sphere. I have heard her go into a pretty decently high head voice though, so her voice definitely has potential to get into that space, but again, she's using a more light configuration, but slightly less airy, less nasal, and less soft than Gowon, but in my opinion, doesn't have the range potential and the other aspects of her voice that the next person coming up does. A nice, soothing, calm voice, however. So to me, Yeojin is a little bit better than Olivia in terms of vocal versatility and variety, I would say. The interesting thing about her voice is it's almost got a character it needs to fit, being a tiny maknae, and the voice that she actually has. Let's watch her sing and I'll get into that. as I say, Yeojin is a very, very small maknae who debuted when she was, what, like 14 or 15. So she, again, was stylistically singing this very cute, very nasal, kind of soft, childlike voice. And if that was the vocals that she had right now, she would be placed a little bit lower. But as she matured and got older, her voice actually got pretty heavy and pretty deep. And she has a couple of different vocal styles that I think one is pretty good and one isn't so good. It's why I place her a little bit lower. Firstly, her lower range is really nice. It's not fully developed necessarily because she sings, again, with quite a lot of air down there, but she has a lower range, a lot more than the rest of the guys I mentioned so far. It's very airy and heavy like that. So there isn't a great deal of chord closure to bring up into a higher space or mix into a higher space or really go much lower, but it's definitely a low range that is the best I've mentioned so far. As she goes higher, one of two things happens. Either she keeps it fairly open, fairly light, which leads to a pretty decent range potential. Again, due to the lack of chord closure being used down low, it's not a super big, mega heavy mix or really intense power vocals like some of the guys coming up that I will mention, but she has an upper range that is pretty well developed and pretty well utilised, and she can get there on occasion. Sometimes she falls back into that baby role, almost probably because she's kind of used to doing that and had to do that for her debut song, where it goes very nasal, very shallow and very wide, and again goes into that baby cutesy style, which isn't technically as impressive as the rest of the guys coming up. So, for me, she's a little bit inconsistent, but when she's good, she's really decent. Nice lower range, decent higher range, but the middle of her voice can occasionally become a little bit too playful, but that, again, is probably because she's used to the role that she has to play. Okay, so Hyunjin is another interesting one because I've seen her placed kind of all over. Some think she's a lot higher than this, some think she's a little bit lower than this. To me, this is a really good place for her because, in my opinion, she's more consistent than the guys I mentioned so far, but does limit herself technically compared to some of the guys I'm going to mention coming up. So this is where I personally think she fits. Let's watch it sing.
Yeah! I just want you for my own, more than you could ever know. 내 맘을 깨워준 목소리, 너의 목소리. Listen, listen, 너에게 난 들려주고 싶었던.
So, the first thing I want to address is I've seen some people claim that Hyunjin lacks power. Now, that's a strange statement because she does and she doesn't. So she obviously doesn't because, as the Loona fandom know, she sings into the unknown like a lot. There's a lot of clips of her singing that particular belt note, and she clearly, when she wants to add a little bit more chord closure to her sound, has that particular part of her voice and that particular key down really efficiently, really well. It's nice and forward, nice and open, no obvious placement issues in that particular note because she's clearly practiced it an awful lot. As she goes for slightly higher ones, the tightness and the lack of head dominant placement really does come into its own, but in that particular space, she has power and projection and it's really good. Her singing voice generally, however, is a lot lighter than that. So, for me, she has a nice consistent tone in the middle of her voice, but she sings again with a lot of air, but it's a naturally kind of more forward placement than the guys I mentioned so far. So, when she utilises that more airy configuration, it brings it to a lighter, nice, easy space all the way in the middle, and because she has a little bit of projection in her voice when she wants to get to it, she can flip from that coordination into a slightly higher, slightly more full configuration. However, because she doesn't do it on a great deal of occasions, and she's more used to doing that particular into the unknown note, her voice can sometimes get a little bit tight and a little bit squeezed as she goes into a belt, so she generally favours a more head voice leaning, falsetto, soft, light approach. So for me, she's pretty consistent and her voice works where it works really well. There is a few tuning issues here and there, but she does limit herself somewhat without using the head voice placement while she's bringing more weight up into that space, and instead she uses a more thin light coordination like everyone else I mentioned so far. Now, Choerry, I believe she's pronounced. There is an O, so I'm not sure if it's Choerry or Cherry, or if it's, please don't kill me, I'm not fully sure. I want to make a statement. In years to come, when this girl is given more lines and more confidence, she is going to be higher and very good. Right now her voice has something it works in very well, and just snippets of other things that work super well. But right now I think there's other people do more. But let's just watch her sing and I'll try and explain what I mean.
행복한 나라 바다를 볼 수 있는 창문이 좋아요 낑깡밭 199 감귤도 오늘도 좋아 그대 곁이면 행복한 나라서
Okay, so Choerry's voice is super interesting because she does one thing with it that makes it really consistent, but also shows other parts where there's more in the tank, and I know there is. So generally, she again sings this kind of lighter, softer, cutesy vocal style, like other guys I mentioned so far, but she has something those guys don't, which is a pretty consistent chord closure. Now, it's not a heavy sound, she's not bringing up a lot of weight into that space, which is really good. She's using that thin, light, slightly airy coordination to get into this middle part of her voice really efficiently, nice and easily, and there's no over-compression if she brings up too much chest voice. Her voice is soft and light, but it's also got a little bit of projection, almost the perfect amount for this vocal style. So when she's in this place, as she goes a little bit higher, she can either, more often than not, go into a head voice, one of, in my opinion, so far, the best developed head voice. She's really tuneful, there's no tuning issues in the middle of her voice whatsoever, and there's no inconsistencies in placement. It's very, very consistent in this middle, light, easy space. But sometimes she has shown snippets that she sometimes can bring it slightly more into her head, maintain some of the weight, bring it nice and forward, and get into a pretty high resonant mix. Again, it's not like power vocals in terms of sustained notes or big belting, but she definitely has an avenue to her voice that is somewhat unexplored, but is definitely present, and I know she can do more with it if the company give her more lines in that particular avenue of her voice, because it's light, it's soft, it's thin, but it's just heavy enough to work really well in that middle space, and that's why she's so consistent, and in my opinion the best I mentioned so far, but has just untapped potential a little bit higher, which could bring her higher in future. Oh, but you agree, right? Choerry's got something that we're not seeing. Now, this is the most exciting part of the list because from 3 till 6, it's debated everywhere who's where. Some people put Jinsoul 3rd, some people put a 4th or 5th. For me, she is 6th because there's one thing people really know her for, but technically she's limiting herself a little bit, but she's really good. Let's watch her sing and I'll explain what I mean. So, what is Jinsoul's voice mainly known for? Power and projection. Now, some people who don't necessarily know vocal production and what makes it really efficient might hear power and projection and think power singer, amazing high notes, fantastic technique. Now, yes and no. Okay, so Jinsoul's voice is quite full and quite heavy. Again, Loona have a lot of deeper voiced women in their group, like mezzo-sopranos possibly, and her voice is really full, has a lot of chord closure, a lot of weight, and a lot of projection. Her voice is known predominantly for when she goes into a higher mixed place with a really big like forward open belt. Now, the issue with her vocals in terms of that is she has a lot of chest voice in her mix. And you can hear as she's going up to her highest notes, yes, they're impressive and powerful and big, but there's also a tightness there. And a chest voice that is present in her sound isn't being allowed to mix down to a head voice to make it really efficient, really resonant, really full, and really open. Again, there's a space where her voice works really well and it sounds projected and big and powerful, but it's not that controlled. And when you really listen to some of the notes, they're not blending down properly and she is sounding quite throaty and quite heavy. It's almost like to yell, it gets a little bit thin sometimes. It's not a bad thing necessarily, she's not doing anything placement-wise super wrong, she's just limiting her vocal approach by putting so much weight into her mix. If she just lightened down with a little bit of head voice, she would have a great range potential into a higher mixed belly space and could be lead/main vocal potential. Right now, there's a lot of weight all the way through her voice. When that gets into the middle of her voice, outside of just the belting, again, it can sound a little bit constricted, a little bit overcompressed, and a little bit strained. Now, that's, again, not the ideal way to sing that particular part of her voice. If she lightened it a little bit and brought a little bit of nasality and possibly to thin it out or bring it a little bit more forward, her voice would be immaculate and very good. But right now, she's got good lows, nice, solid, thick voice, a good belt, if not a little bit technically limiting because she's putting a little bit too much weight in there. But in the middle of her voice, for me personally, isn't as varied, as controlled, and as easy as the rest of the guys coming up. But she's a very good singer. I understand if you put her higher, but for me personally, 6th makes the most sense. Now, again, I understand the reasons for Jinsoul being higher than Kim Lip being higher than Jinsoul. It just comes down to what I deem more important, control or power. And for me, Kim Lip's got a little bit more consistency and control in her vocal delivery all the way through because of how she implements placement. Jinsoul's still amazing, but for me, Kim Lip's a little bit more controlled. Let's watch her sing and I'll get to it.
대서 눈을 떴을 때 널 끌어안을 때 난 느낄 수가 있어 신비로워 널 둘러싼 공기에 사로잡혀 속에 단 하나의 소원 이뤄진 그 고백
Okay, so Kim Lip's voice quite obviously has quite a lot of nasality present. Now, this is a negative and a positive. The main positive aspect of nasality, if you're not sure, is it really brings your voice more forward, thins out and lightens it and gets into a more forward space. What that does is allow for higher notes and middle of your voice to be much easier to produce naturally. What the negative nasality is it can sometimes, if it's being brought up too high and used too extensively, can basically get your voice stuck in your throat and make everything way too tight. Now for me, Kim Lip's voice it bridges this gap a little bit. In her middle of her voice, her nasality makes it really easy to bring a little bit of closure up, and she has a really nice, sustained, light, easy middle of her voice. It's not a super powerful mix like Jinsoul's. She hasn't got mad power in that particular aspect, but her voice is really easy, consistent, light, but just enough chord closure to make it a decently projected sound in the middle of her voice because that nasality brings it forward and thins it out and makes high notes slightly easy to produce. As she goes a little bit higher, because she is using so much nasality that she doesn't really get rid of much, her voice has more of a tendency to flip into a falsetto place. Now this isn't necessarily the best thing in terms of overall vocal potential and getting to a really high mixed space, but it means that her voice is consistent in terms of use of falsetto flip and transitioning and being able to use a lighter tone in that particular key in the higher part of her voice. I've also heard Kim Lip sometimes use a lot more weight and put it mainly in her head and place it forward and unleash pretty decent head dominant mixes. Again, they're not the most efficient things I've ever heard, and the nasality is making them a little bit thin and tight in the throat, but to me, her overall vocals in the middle of her voice is a lot more consistent and controlled than Jinsoul's, and the higher end is less powerful but also kind of has their own technical limitations. Down low, she sounds pretty consistent, pretty solid, and when she gets rid of the nasality, her voice sounds like it's got a decent freedom, a lot of fullness, and a nice tuning down the lower end of her voice. So yeah, for me, Kim Lip's voice is more controlled than Jinsoul's, not as powerful, but it's just got a little bit more control in the middle of her voice, which I deem a little bit more important, but I understand if you put Jinsoul higher because of the power and the placement of the production. Okay, so Heejin is the person I changed my mind on the most. I initially had it down at 5th or 6th, I can't fully remember, but something about the control and the range she operates in all the way through her voice made me think that she actually has a decent level of skill and is actually a pretty decent vocalist. Let's watch her sing and I'll try and break it down.
said this was a physical. You wanna burst like can't stop feelings aside. Truth be told, I want you to want me too. I know I didn't sound up as a casually, but I felt this 쥐삼 더 캐스티. 특별하게 느껴지는 오늘 밤, 왜 네 심장은 빨리 뛰는지. 시간이 됐어. 얘기를 걷고 달콤한 사랑 속삭여요. 시간 속 있을까 어느 날처럼 내게 너 하나뿐인가. 나 You're my star. Tonight make you mine. 사이의 우주를 건너 내게로 날아와줘. 더 이상 기다리게 하지 마.
Okay, so for me so far, Heejin's voice has the most areas it kind of shines in pretty well. Because she's predominantly known for having a pretty deep, again, more mezzo-soprano voice, jazzy in timbre, and really nice in this kind of area. Again, she doesn't sing with a huge amount of chord closure, so her voice isn't like heavy or super full, but she has a nice lower range that a lot of people in the group don't necessarily have access to naturally, so that's a good advantage that she does have with her voice. What she does a lot in the middle of her voice is she sings with a good amount of chord closure again, but it's nice and forward and nice and open. There isn't way too much air in the sound like some people operate with, so that doesn't mean that she's kind of not used to bringing her voice into a higher space, and when she goes into a higher, bigger chord closure, heavy space, she's not struggling because she hasn't got the chord closure feeling before and just isn't used to kind of singing with a slightly more projection and power, so her voice doesn't get super tight and super heavy. Her voice isn't necessarily the most free in a higher area because it is heavier with more weight and more chord closure. So when she goes up into a belt, there's occasionally a little bit of thinness and tightness, but she has shown sometimes that she can place the voice in her head and use a nice, decently powerful head dominant mix. Again, it's not the most efficient mix I've ever heard in my life. It's not as good as people coming up and as controlled as people coming up. But for me, she has basically Kim Lip's middle of her voice without the nasality present, so tonally it's more desirable, and she obviously has the lows that most people don't have, and then this head dominant mix up top that she has shown a couple of times that showcases she does have a pretty decent, versatile, varied voice. As well as that, she uses head voice pretty well. When she transitions up into that space, it sounds nice and thin and light and easy. So for me, she has good tones when she's singing lighter, good tones when she's singing a little bit heavier, and the middle of her voice is pretty open and resonant and has a nice space in that area, even though her voice is a little bit full and a little bit heavier. But there is a little bit of tightness present, more so than there is of the people coming up in my personal opinion, which is a pretty good vocalist and will only get better. Okay, so at the end of the really big battle that a lot of people dispute, I think Yves makes it here in terms of consistency, control, and use of air in her sound. I think she's got a really, really polished, decent voice. Not fully technically there right now, but she could easily get there. And she does a few things that the rest of the guys I mentioned do slightly more consistently, in my personal opinion. Let's watch this thing.
전화 한 번만 기운찬 목소리로 정말 헤어졌나 봐. Upsetting too. I don't know what to say to you. Nothing I can do. I like you. Sorry I never meant to. But a wicked and it wasn't like I to say. Well, look at you and I won't have you any other way. 존심 때문에. 항상 망설이던 내가 When I say girls, girls I'm a one 그대로 이루어질 거야 서도 널 붙잡을 수가 없는 바보 같은 내 너무 사랑해 우리 절대 헤어져 In my heart Just like a oil on my head.
Okay, so once again, I've heard there's like an unofficial Loona deep voice line. I'm pretty sure Yves fits here as well. Her voice. So, again, the low end of her voice, she's got a nice smoky, jazzy timbre, kind of similar to Heejin, but she doesn't... She projects slightly a little bit more instead of being like, she's like, So she's got a bit of a fuller, thicker voice. So when she is kind of in her lows, her voice sounds smoky, it sounds resonant, it sounds like it can sustain pretty well in that particular area. And the rest of the low voiced people in this group can kind of do that, but they utilize a little bit more air in that area. But for me, Yves uses that part of her voice particularly more efficiently. The thing that makes her voice for me quite good is because it is heavier and fuller, she could bring that core closure up a little bit similar to Heejin does and kind of start straining into a higher place. For me, she utilizes air a lot more effectively. As she kind of goes into the middle of her voice, she brings in a little bit more air into the sound, but not air as a crutch where it becomes the only phonetic part of the actual sound. It's just helping thin everything out and lighten the whole tone to get into an efficient middle space without bringing up too much weight from the lower end of her voice into a more problematic overcompression. So that allows her to basically transition from this middle part of voice, which uses more air and is more free and more easy, bring the core closure up from before, mixing it with that air into a nice full belt. Her belt isn't super high or head dominant, and I think she could place her voice in her head a little bit more with that weight to unlock more potential in terms of a higher mix space. But right now she has a nice full chest dominant mix, and because she uses air a little bit lower, it's got a nice freedom and a nice phonetic quality. There is again a little bit of tightness there, just as there is in Heejin's voice, but for me personally, all the way through, her vocals have a little bit more control and a little bit better use of air than everyone I've mentioned so far. And yes, she might not have the power of Jinsoul, the control in the middle like Kim Lip, or the full range of Heejin, but for me she mixes those three together the best of everyone from 3 to 6, in my personal opinion. Now, Haseul, I believe is how you pronounce it, is a really interesting case. So of course she hasn't been in the last few comebacks, so we haven't really seen how her vocals have improved in a commercial setting, but I know she has operatic and classical training, so it really helps explain why her voice works where it works so well. Let's watch her sing and I will break it down. So as I say, Haseul has classical training, and as far as I'm aware, if there's any female classical singers in the comment section, please correct me if I'm wrong, but predominantly they are trained to sing this really kind of thin, sharp, head voice, rounded, darker timbre and style. Now there are clips of her doing that, and classically she's obviously technically very proficient, and she can sing in that higher key very, very, very well. That doesn't necessarily conform over to contemporary singing, which is in my opinion why she is number 2 rather than number 1, because she doesn't quite have the ability to have the versatility in her voice to really sing pop in a lot of different ways like number 1 does for me personally. But what that classical training really allows to happen for Haseul's voice is firstly her head voice is the best in the group by far, obviously. It's got range, ping, sharpness, a good rounded sound to it. It's got versatility, and she's very good in this head voice area, which shows amazing vocal control, because it is quite hard to sing on pitch very well in a thin light coordination, which obviously classical singers have to do, particularly the female variety. When she brings her voice a little bit lower, what her ability in her head voice allows for her to do is sing really light in a middle high space really easily. Her voice, melodically, when she's in a modal voice, she sings a lot of the time in kind of a thin, light, easy configuration, but pretty damn high, because she's so used to singing more like that. So when she brings it a little bit further down, her voice is still light and easy. So she's got a nice capability in this middle space without overcompressing or bringing up too much weight in her sound. She's also short on occasion. She can occasionally bring it a little bit more beefy and beef it up and bring a little bit more core closure up into a more of a belted sound. Again, it's not her forte. She's much better singing light and controlled, but her voice does have the capability to go a little bit more projected. Now, she doesn't have the low notes and kind of the airiness in her voice as Yves and everybody else does so far, but in my opinion, in terms of the key that K-pop operates in, she has a lot of control, and it's very, very, very vocally desirable to be able to sing that high, that easily, with that much freedom. And for me, that's why Haseul is second. There is an argument that could be placed for third, possibly, if you think other people can do more. Her versatility might not be as high as everybody else, but her control, because of her training, is absolutely fantastic. Just commercially, she isn't quite as versatile as number 1. Now, in terms of a main vocalist, I'm not sure if Loona have a main vocalist, but if they did, it would be Chuu. Chuu's voice is exactly what you want for a K-pop main vocalist, particularly when you sing in this particular key. She's got the highest voice, but also uses it really well with power and projection. Let's watch her sing, and I will break it down.
지금 이 느낌이 싫어 난 어디론 가슴 또만 내가 서 있을게요 화려하지 않아도 우리 Sorry for today since I'm sad You wanna fall outside 참 좋았잖아요 함께했던 약속들을 지금도 영원히 기억하 이대로 내 곁에 있어야 해요 My baby 나도 몰래 다가오는 설렘에 내가 그렇게 했어 날 위하는 척하지만
Okay, so Chuu's voice is, again, pretty interesting, but it's used super efficiently. She's predominantly known for her higher belting, and then obviously in High and a couple of other performances, she is the one that does the open mixed resonant high belt, which she does very efficiently, which I'll get to in a second. But all the way through her voice, she sings with a lot of control. She sings, again, pretty light, but it's not too cutesy, it's not too shallow, it's not too thin, there isn't too much air in the sound, it's just light. She has a naturally high voice and a naturally very good tessitura, comfortable range for K-pop, which makes her singing style very handy and very useful. I've noticed she does have a slight stamina issue, that when she kind of sings slightly more fast-paced songs, she can't transition up through all the registers that well. But when she sings in a normal kind of modal configuration, she's light and thin and easy and not overcompressing any single part of the middle of her voice, which allows for the rest of her voice to have a lot more freedom, because when that chord collage does come in, it allows to go into a nice forward, open, big space, nice open mouth, and she has a nice, beautiful, open belt. She is the person in the group that has by far the most resonant mixed voice. She utilizes her head voice nice and efficiently into it and kind of allows that space to be predominantly where it's used. As I say, it brings it forward, opens the mouth wide, brings a bit of the weight up. There isn't too much weight in her voice, which makes it nice and flexible and nice and free. And she's the one that can unleash the big open resonant belt and has by far the most power potential up in that high key, which in K-pop is of course what you predominantly want. So, for me personally, she has fantastic control all the way through her range. She sounds really good when singing light, which is of course what you want for a lot of K-pop bridges and kind of verses. And then she can do the big money notes because she can allow that space to be used to bring up weight into her vocals and big open resonant full belts. So yes, Chuu is absolutely the best commercial and contemporary singer in Loona in my personal opinion. Haseul will be the best classical, and the rest of the guys you can fight over if you want to, but for me Chuu takes the top spot. Okay guys, thank you so much for watching. I'm not fully sure what video will be next. I think I might do a vocal analysis again, possibly. It didn't get too many views last time, but it's what I predominantly want to do, so I will keep trying to push them and hopefully you guys will take them a little bit better. But thank you so much for watching the Loona episode. BTS, NCT, all the big boys, there is still going to happen. Not sure fully when, but they will. But thank you so much for watching the Loona episode. I hope you enjoyed it, and goodbye.